Hi, and welcome to the Ministry Network podcast. I'm your host, James Baird. Today, we'll be speaking with Pastor Stephen Witmer. Pastor Witmer is the author of the book, A Big Gospel in Small Places. Now, let's talk with Pastor Witmer. Well, Pastor Witmer, thank you so much for joining us here on Ministry Network.
It's my pleasure to be here.
We're so excited about our topic for today. You've written a wonderful book titled A Big Gospel in Small Places. Would you mind telling us a little bit of the story behind the book?
Yeah, I have been at my church in Pepperell, Massachusetts, an hour northwest of Boston for about 12 and a half years now. And the book is really kind of an overflow of my own joy in ministry and my own struggles in ministry. A number of years ago, I just started to, maybe 3 or 4 years ago, I really started to think more kind of self-consciously about the context of my ministry and it kind of, just reflect on what had gone well, what I had struggled with. And those thoughts started to come together in both some writing about small town ministry and then the launching of a ministry called Small Town Summits. And so the book was born out of my own local ministry, but also the folks I was meeting, the people I was partnering with to pull off small town summits.
Can you tell us a little about your initial decision to take your current call?
Yeah, I love the fact that God just takes us in unexpected directions. And my present location was not where I was seeking to wind up. In fact, in some ways, for the 12 or 13 years before arriving here, it was the kind of place I was seeking to avoid. So I grew up in a very small town in north central Maine. And somewhere along the line, I kind of imbibed this idea that I would be more successful if I got away from little towns and traveled far from my hometown. And so for over a decade, I was doing that, living in suburbs and cities and doing higher education, teaching at a seminary. But I had this deep sense of call to New England specifically, because I'm from the state of Maine. And I had a sense of, God's great work through the Great Awakening. I had a knowledge of the kind of spiritual hardness of New England. And also I sense I have an advantage because I'm from New England. I'm not from away. So I wanted to come back to New England. And my sense was I would wind up in probably a city somewhere that at the time, especially through seminary and reading in the broader evangelical culture, that was my understanding of success. And so I was teaching at Gordon Conwell Seminary, teaching New Testament, looking for pastoral positions. And I got pretty far along in the process with 2 different churches. One was this church and another was closer into the city. There were a lot of university students. There's a Fortune 500 CEO on the board. And that one on paper looked like the one to go with.
Yeah.
And that was the career move. And over the course of, maybe a month or 2, it became very clear to my wife and to me that we should pursue this one and not the other one. And we pulled out of that process. And God made it clear through a number of means. There was a certain internal sense. There was the counsel of mentors and kind of wisdom. Ironically, the fact that we weren't looking for this kind of church, we weren't looking to go to a small town. My wife is from the city. That actually increased our sense that this was from God because I knew I wasn't trying to persuade myself into something I wanted. It was counterintuitive enough that I thought, well, the fact that this seems the way God is leading, that's actually strangely confirmatory.
Well, to take a step back and to look at this from a higher level, could you unpack for us why it is that God cares about churches in small towns as much as he cares about churches that are big and in, metropolitan areas?
Yeah, I think the short answer is just that there are people there and God cares about people. Every small place is a place. And so a doctrine of creation would suggest that God is the creator. God doesn't create junk. And so God loves the place and he loves the people in the place. And the fact that there are fewer people per square foot doesn't matter to him. It's still deeply, deeply valuable. The Son of God came to a small place. Nazareth was 200 to 400 people. So we know he cares about it.
How would you respond to the person who says, yeah, that's true, but you can reach so many more people at these other locations and the gospel can spread so much further? How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I mean, I bought into that thinking for a good couple decades of my life. That was setting the trajectory for me. And I really wrestle with that and engage with it in my book. I give a whole chapter and more to that question. And I think of it as, refer to it as the kind of urban prioritization model. There's a kind of an urban apologetic that says if you reach the cities, you gain the countryside. If you gain the countryside, but don't have the cities, you've lost the culture. And so the way to get the culture, the way to get the most people is to go upstream and influence influencers and then see that trickle down. So, get the folks who are setting culture, get the folks who are setting fashion and education and government policy. And I think there are numerous reasons to push back against that. In my book, I want to say, I'm trying to be super careful here and not in advocating for God calling some people to rural or small town ministry. I'm not trying to say we shouldn't be called to the city. We shouldn't go to the city. I think more people ought to go to the city, and more people. I want God to call more people to the countryside too. So, I don't. I'm not even trying to rally the troops to small towns. I'm just trying to open people to being persuadable by God to go to small towns. So, yeah, my response to that kind of urban apologetic that says, if you get the city, you get the small towns thrown in is, there's several responses to that. One is, I'm not sure that works strategically. I'm not sure culture works quite that easily. I mean, we have just come through another very contentious and very divided election, and we saw it clearly in 2016, and we saw it just as clearly in 2020 that there is an enormous urban-rural split. There have been books written since 2016, books called, books like The Left Behind by Robert Wethnow. And they're all about this kind of poor white constituency, largely small town rural folks who feel left behind. They don't fit with the blue coasts. And, it's clear that at least politically, the small towns don't always follow the cultural lead of the blue coasts and the big cities. So that's one question I have, just strategically. If you get the cities clearly, politically, you don't necessarily get the small towns thrown in. I think the same thing is true spiritually. Usually the way people are impacted for the gospel is through personal relationships. And everybody would agree. Now, there's a little difference in this maybe during the time of COVID. We are seeing some out-migration from the cities to the countryside. People are working remotely and they're saying, I could move away from the cities, so keep my job. So we're seeing some people move to the countryside. But by and large, the flow of population in the world today is the world is urbanizing. We're more than 50% urban now. And population flow is the flow of personal influence. And so if we're tracking personal influence and we want to reach the country by going to the city, that's not the way the population is flowing. In fact, I argue maybe we need to invert this and say there's a certain sense in which the country can influence the city even more than the city influencing the country. Now, broadly, culturally speaking, Pepperell is not setting fashion trends. We're not producing entertainment like Hollywood is. But our young people are going to the cities. And so there's a level of personal influence. So I want to push back against that kind of urban prioritization model, that kind of cultural influence model in those ways by asking those questions. And then also just say, I'm not really sure that the New Testament and particularly the ministry of the Apostle Paul kind of source that urban thesis the way some have made his ministry out to do. Actually, Paul and Barnabas surely went to the countryside. They were not taking JetBlue from city to city and, over the farm fields in between to get from, one city to another, from Thessalonica to Corinth. They either were, taking a ship or they were going overland and they were going through the countryside. They were going through small towns. And there's no way in the world that they wouldn't have been sharing the gospel. In fact, there are references in Acts. Paul says, I evangelize the countryside. So we have explicit evidence from Paul that he didn't just preach the gospel in cities. He's made out to do that sometimes.
In what way is being called to ministry in a small town a unique calling? And how might someone who's in pastoral ministry discern whether or not they're called to that?
Well, so much of small town ministry is just ministry. I don't know what percentage is just when you're doing ministry, it doesn't matter where you're doing it, you're interacting with people. And so you're going to get tough stuff. You're going to get unexpected stuff. It's going to be draining. It's going to be exhilarating. It's going to be joy producing, and it's going to be a downer sometimes. And so, a lot of ministries there's overlap with whether it's urban ministry. I've done urban ministry and suburban ministry, and certainly not everything is unique. I think there are things that are unique about small town ministry. To some degree, it's the pace of small town life. It can be slower. That's partly because people like slow. They like familiar. That's one of the reasons they're there in the small town. Now, that's not always the case, obviously, but sometimes it is. Also, it's just smaller. I mean, by definition, it is a small town or a rural area. And so generally, but not always, the churches are smaller, and therefore you have fewer resources. The good thing is that you often know more people, or you can connect with more people. So there are facets of small town ministry that are distinct, that are unique. And those are good things. They're good things, and there are challenges as well. There's sometimes a lack of resources. Sometimes, ministry changes come more slowly than you would like them to. And in a world where we are very connected, especially over social media, it's easy to kind of, the grass is greener on the other side of the social media fence. So you can be tracking with other pastors and other churches and seeing all this exciting ministry that's happening. And in a small place, it might not look like that. It might be quite different. I think there are many ways to be called to ministry in general, and then there are many ways to be called to small town ministry in particular. And, how do you experience a call to ministry? I think it comes in numerous ways. Sometimes it's aptitude. Sometimes it's life circumstance. Could be a very clear impression or sense from God. This is right. Could be the counsel of your friends. Certainly your local church should be deeply involved. So in terms of being called to small place ministry in particular, I think sometimes it comes because you just have this deep love for small places. It might be that you were raised in a little town. A lot of people who live in cities were born in little towns. And I know some who have moved from big places back to little places, maybe back to their hometown. I have a friend who moved back into the house that he grew up in. He bought it from his parents and planted a church in this tiny little Iowa town. And so, it could be that you just feel deeply drawn to that kind of small culture. Could be that you really don't feel drawn to it, but you feel a keen awareness of the needs of those places. And so even though it's not, what your natural preference, you feel this deep need to go minister there. It could be that, other reasons. It might be that for the sake of your spouse, you're moving back to be closer to family, and God folds that together with an opening in a church. So many, many ways that you can wind up in a small place.
I think it's really easy for people, even if they're not consciously thinking this, that they just have this sense that, bigger is safer and small is risky. If you go to a big church, they can advance your career, and maybe your family has a better school system, and, we could extrapolate out from there. How would you help someone who's wrestling with that sort of perspective on things?
Yeah, it's interesting. I guess you could see risks both ways too. You could say, man, this church, you could take this down in a million different ways. The pressure of the limelight or publicity is, so we've seen large churches even recently collapsing, and there are so many risks in a big place too. I do think sometimes I actually see this as an advantage of small town, small church ministry. Sometimes I think we see with greater clarity our weakness. I do think in ministry where the seats are all filled, where the budget is being exceeded every month, where there are buildings being built and churches being planted, it can be easier to hide behind those things and not admit our weakness and our need for God. And in a small church, in a small place, we are confronted, I think, with our weakness in a way that we might not be otherwise. You don't have the joy of welcoming newcomers every week. Maybe you haven't had a newcomer in 6 months. Maybe it's that the congregation is smaller now because someone died or someone got a job somewhere else and moved away. And so you look out over your congregation, maybe there are 30 people, maybe there are, 150 people, but you are not impressive by any standard. And say you have a revival and you double your congregation size. I mean, that's incredible. You've doubled in, say, a year. You're still looking at it. If you were 30, you're 60 people now. You're small. You're still not impressive. So there are fewer things to hide behind that would shelter you from an awareness of your reliance on God. You realize if one family stops giving, you might not make budget. Your pastor might need to go part-time. So I think there's a sense in some small, not every small town church, but in some small churches that are in small towns, there's a sense of kind of fragility, a sense of we need God to show up because our musicians, they love the Lord, but they're not going to sell any albums, They don't have their own Spotify channel. So, there's our pastor's not preaching sermons that are downloaded by a gazillion people every week. So if this is going to matter, God has to be in this, and we are relying on God. So I think sometimes with small, slow things, there is just a greater sense of weakness. And the good news there is that God loves it when we are aware of our weakness and admit it, and he shows up and he's drawn to that. He loves that.
In your book, you also talk about how we shouldn't see ministry in a small town as sort of like just a step towards ministry in a big city. Can you unpack that for us?
Yeah. I mean, often ministry in a small town might be a path to somewhere else. It has been for some of my ministry heroes. So, Martin Lloyd-Jones pastored in a small Welsh town, and then he went to London. And Tim Keller pastored in a small town was it Hopewell, Virginia? I think it was in Virginia for 9 years, I think it was, before he went to Manhattan. And I'm sure glad he went to Manhattan. And I'm sure glad Martin Lloyd-Jones went to London. That was God's call on the lives of those men. And I wouldn't have been there trying to persuade him to stay. And I'm glad they went. But it would have been, I think, absolutely wrong if Tim Keller had gone to that little town with the intention of honing his ministry skills, cutting his teeth, biding his time, and then stepping up to the major leagues. I'm confident that was not his intention.
Actually, whenever he got the chance to go to New York, he was a professor at Westminster, and everyone thought, he was too nerdy and that he'd spent too much time in rural Virginia, that there's no way he could, do well with all the urbanites.
Oh, that's really interesting. I didn't know that aspect of the story. I think it really comes down to love. And if you are going to a place in order to get practice to go to the place you really want to go, you can't love those people. You're looking through those people, not at them. You're using them, and that's the opposite of love. So Wendell Berry says somewhere that too many rural churches have been forced to put up with the mistakes and to pay for the education of young pastors. They're basically funding ministry training for urban churches. And I think that has been kind of a pattern, and it's wrong for us to use anyone to get what it is we ultimately want. So if God calls us to a small place, he may well call us away to a bigger place. And I've tried to do thinking and writing on small town ministry in a way that it would never be hypocritical if God called me to a big city. I don't anticipate that he will, but if he ever would, I would want to be able to hold up my book and say, yeah, I still believe all this. I wasn't just using this to get to where I wanted to go. So I'm absolutely convinced that sometimes God does call us away. We don't always need to stay where we are forever. He's going to stay in that place forever. He's never going to leave that town. He might call us to a different outpost, but it's not wrong for us to go if he calls us, but it is certainly wrong for us to go with the intention of getting somewhere else.
Join us next time as we continue our conversation with Pastor Stephen Witmer. In the meantime, Visit ministrynetwork.com/behind the pulpit to learn about our new teaching series.